A gang of bikers threatens to beat up an elderly stranger at a small-town diner, mocking the quiet man in black as he sits alone drinking coffee. The leather-clad thugs terrorize the waitress, assault the retired sheriff, and surround the soft-spoken traveler who barely looks up from his meal. But what these criminals don't realize is that this calm stranger is Steven Seagal, the legendary martial artist who's been breaking bones and taking names for over 5 decades. The bikers laugh at the old man, who thinks he can take on 12 hardened criminals, completely unaware they're facing a 5-time world karate champion whose aikido skills have left countless opponents unconscious on movie sets and in real life. While the gang leader throws the first punch, expecting an easy victory, he's actually about to learn why you never underestimate a master who spent 70 years perfecting the art of warfare. The diner erupts in chaos as fists fly and bodies hit the floor, but only one man remains standing when the dust settles. What happens when street thugs pick a fight with Hollywood's deadliest action star? Will any of the bikers survive their encounter with a living legend? What happened next would terrorize the gang for the rest of their pathetic lives. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lone Harley-Davidson cruised down Highway 89 through the Montana Badlands, its rider a tall figure in black leather against the endless expanse of Big Sky country. Weathered fence posts and abandoned farmhouses dotted the landscape like forgotten memories, testament to dreams that had withered under the relentless sun. Steven Seagal shifted slightly in his seat, his graying ponytail catching the afternoon breeze. At 73, he moved with the fluid economy of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled power. The bike's rumble provided a meditative rhythm as he passed a faded sign. Millerville, Pop 847, ST 1923. Ruby's roadside diner appeared ahead like a chrome and glass relic from the 1950s. Its neon sign flickered EA instead of Eats, and peeling paint told stories of countless travelers who had stopped for coffee and conversation over the decades. Seagal pulled into the gravel parking lot, his boots crunching on the stones as he dismounted. Inside, the diner embodied small-town America at its most authentic. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, a checkerboard floor gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the comforting aroma of bacon grease and fresh coffee filled the air. Behind the counter, Dolores Kowalski, 67 with kind silver hair, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades serving others. Pete Morrison, a burly trucker in his 50s, sat hunched over a newspaper at the corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Nearby, Earl Patterson, 72 years old with the straight-backed posture of a career lawman, studied the crossword puzzle with intelligent blue eyes that missed nothing. Jenny Bradford, 19 and blonde, wiped down tables with the focused attention of someone working her way through college one shift at a time. Her bright smile lit up as she glanced toward the elderly customers who had become like family over the years. Seagal entered quietly, his movements deliberate and economical. He chose the corner booth, back to the wall, facing the door, a habit ingrained through decades of training and experience. When Dolores approached with the coffee pot, he spoke in measured tones barely above a whisper. "Coffee and apple pie, please." His dark eyes took in every detail of the peaceful scene. The faded photographs of local landmarks on the walls, the gentle murmur of conversation, the sense of community that bound these people together like invisible threads. This was America, as it was meant to be, honest, hardworking, built on mutual respect and shared values that in the distance, barely audible over the diner's quiet hum, came the faint rumble of approaching motorcycles. The rumble grew steadily louder until 12 Harley-Davidsons roared into Millerville's main street like mechanical thunder. Their riders hooped and revved engines in a deliberate display of intimidation that sent shopkeepers scurrying behind locked doors and mothers pulling children inside. The Hells Wolves Motorcycle Club had arrived. Douglas Crusher Mackenzie led the pack, 250 pounds of tattoos and muscle astride a chrome-heavy chopper. His leather vest bore patches marking him as a one-percenter, the kind of outlaw who wore his criminality like a badge of honor. Beside him, Ray Snake Valdez showed gold teeth in a predatory grin, the switchblade scar across his cheek pale against sun-weathered skin. They had been running protection rackets across 3 states, targeting isolated communities where law enforcement response crawled at the speed of bureaucracy. Millerville looked perfect, small enough to control, remote enough to avoid interference, and wealthy enough to make extortion profitable. The gang parked aggressively across multiple spaces in front of Ruby's, their engines backfiring like gunshots in the afternoon quiet. Chrome gleamed and leather creaked as they dismounted, their boots heavy on asphalt still soft from the day's heat. Inside the diner, the atmosphere shifted like air pressure before a tornado. Ginny's hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Earl's fingers moved instinctively toward where his service weapon had once rested. Pete looked up from his newspaper, recognizing trouble with a trucker's hard-earned wisdom. Only the stranger in black remained perfectly still, his coffee cup steady in weathered hands. The bikers burst through the door with calculated loudness, their presence filling the small space like smoke from a house fire. Snake positioned himself by the exit while others spread out to dominate the counter and booths. This wasn't random chaos. It was a tactical deployment designed to control terrain and intimidate civilians. Crusher surveyed the room like a predator selecting prey, his shark-dead eyes cataloging potential resistance and valuable targets. The elderly, the young, the working class, all represented opportunities for profit and entertainment. Well, he announced in a voice like gravel in a cement mixer. Looks like we found ourselves a real friendly little town. The regular customers remained seated, but tension crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. Behind the counter, Dolores backed against the coffee machine as Crusher's shadow fell across her. His meaning was clear, and her face paled as she realized what kind of men had entered her sanctuary. Crusher leaned over the counter, his massive frame casting Dolores in shadow as she pressed against the coffee machine. His breath reeked of beer and cigarettes as he spoke with mock politeness. "Hey there, Grandma. Me and my boys are gonna need some service. And we ain't talking about just coffee." The other bikers laughed and made crude comments, feeding off their leader's aggression like jackals around. A kill. Snake cornered Jenny by the jukebox, running a dirty finger down her arm while making suggestions that made her stomach turn. "Where you going, sweet thing?" he asked when she tried to pull away, his grip tightening enough to leave marks. "We're just getting acquainted." Pete Morrison started to rise from his booth, but 2 bikers immediately flanked him. One pressed a knife against his ribs through his flannel shirt. "Sit down, fat boy, unless you want a new breathing hole." Meanwhile, Crusher continued terrorizing Dolores, deliberately knocking over her coffee pot with the back of his hand. The dark liquid splattered across the checkered floor, forming a brown puddle that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above. "Show some hospitality to paying customers," he demanded, his voice carrying the threat of violence barely held in check. Earl Patterson drew on 40 years of law enforcement experience as he recognized the pattern unfolding before him. These weren't random troublemakers, but organized criminals conducting a systematic intimidation campaign. Despite being 72 and unarmed, he stood slowly, his voice carrying the authority of his former badge. "Gentlemen, I think you've made your point. Perhaps it's time to move along." The diner fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant tick of the wall clock above the cash register. Crusher's eyes narrowed with predatory interest. He had found his primary target. The ex-sheriff stood straight despite his age, blue eyes steady with the kind of courage that couldn't be beaten out of a man. He had faced down armed robbers, domestic abusers, and drunken cowboys over 4 decades of keeping the peace. A gang of bikers didn't intimidate him now. Snake shoved Earl hard in the chest with both hands, putting his full weight behind the assault. The elderly ex-sheriff stumbled backward, his head striking the corner of the lunch counter with a sickening crack that echoed through the suddenly quiet diner. Earl collapsed to the checkered floor, blood pooling beneath his gray hair as Jenny screamed and Dolores gasped in horror. The sound of his fall seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, marking the moment when intimidation became assault, when threat became violence, when evil revealed its true face. Earl lay motionless. On the black and white tiles, a thin stream of blood trickling from his scalp toward the overturned sugar dispenser. Jenny knelt beside him with tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse while the bikers laughed at the old fool who should have minded his own business. Dolores frantically dialed 911 on the diner's rotary phone, her arthritic fingers slipping on the dial as she fought to maintain composure. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the receiver with devastating news. Deputy Rodriguez was responding to a domestic disturbance 50 miles away and wouldn't arrive for at least 90 minutes. State police were even farther out, the Hells. Wolves had timed their visit perfectly. Millerville was completely vulnerable. Crusher knelt beside Earl's prone form and rifled through the unconscious man's wallet, pocketing the cash while making jokes about senior citizen discounts. Snake continued harassing Jenny, now emboldened by the violence, while other bikers ransacked the diner, overturning chairs, smashing ketchup bottles against the walls, and terrorizing Pete Morrison, who sat frozen in his booth. Through it all, the stranger in black remained perfectly still in his corner booth. His coffee cup never wavered in his weathered hands, but his dark eyes tracked every movement with the patience of a coiled spring. He cataloged threats, calculated angles, assessed the tactical situation with the precision of someone who had spent decades studying violence and its prevention. The bikers saw what they expected to see: an elderly man, probably a retiree passing through, too old and frail to matter in their calculations. They dismissed him as thoroughly as they had dismissed Earl Patterson, making the same fatal error that had destroyed countless bullies throughout history. Finally, as Crusher kicked Earl's ribs to see if the old man was conscious, the stranger set down his coffee cup with a soft clink that somehow cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. That he stood slowly, unfolding his tall frame with fluid grace that suggested depths these criminals could not fathom. His presence seemed to fill the room despite his quiet demeanor, drawing every eye toward him as he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying absolute authority. "Perhaps you gentlemen should leave these good people alone." The diner fell completely silent. Crusher straightened to his full intimidating height and turned toward the stranger, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred face as he contemplated this unexpected entertainment. "Well, look what we got here, boys. Another hero." The 12 Hell's Wolves spread out in a loose semicircle around the stranger, their boots scraping against the checkered linoleum as they positioned themselves like hunters surrounding wounded prey. Crusher cracked his knuckles, each pop echoing like gunshots in the tense silence. The bikers saw exactly what they expected: a man in his 70s, average build, speaking softly and moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age. They assumed he was either senile or suicidal, another small-town hero who would back down the moment real violence threatened. "Old man," Crusher growled, flexing massive tattooed arms that had intimidated countless victims across 3 states. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. We're going to enjoy teaching you some respect." Snake pulled his switchblade with theatrical flair, the steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights like a promise of pain. Other bikers produced their own weapons: brass knuckles, chains, tire irons, the tools of professional intimidation that had never failed them in dozens of small towns. They had done this dance before. Elderly heroes usually backed down when confronted with overwhelming force, crawling away with their dignity shattered and their communities left defenseless. This old fool would learn the same lesson, but the stranger didn't retreat. Instead, he took a small step forward, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing deep and controlled. There was something in his posture, a coiled readiness that suggested unfathomable depths beneath the calm surface. His dark eyes surveyed the room with tactical precision, noting exit points, potential weapons, innocent bystanders' locations. The calculations happened in microseconds, processed by a mind that had spent decades studying the geometry of violence. Crusher threw the first punch, a haymaker designed to end the fight before it began. His massive fist whistled through the air with enough force to shatter a jaw, backed by 250 pounds of steroid-enhanced muscle. But the stranger wasn't there anymore. With fluid economy of motion, he stepped offline and caught Crusher's wrist with both hands. Using the biker's own momentum against him, he sent the gang leader flying through Ruby's front window in an explosion of glass and chrome. Crusher landed hard on the gravel parking lot among scattered shards, his leather vest shredded in his face bloody from the impact. Crusher groaned in the parking lot, his leather vest torn and his face streaked with blood from a dozen small cuts. The remaining 11 Hell's Wolves stared in shocked disbelief. Their invincible leader had been dispatched like an amateur by a man old enough to be his grandfather. Then Snake snarled, "Get him!" And they charged as one, filling the diner with the thunder of boots on linoleum and the glint of weapons in fluorescent light. What followed was a masterclass in martial arts precision that would have impressed the greatest masters in history. The stranger moved like flowing water, never where the attacks landed, always in perfect position to counter with devastating efficiency. Snake led with his switchblade, but the stranger caught his wrist with surgical precision, applied pressure to a nerve point, and the weapon clattered to the floor as Snake screamed in agony. A spinning throw sent the lieutenant crashing into the jukebox, which exploded in sparks and died with a mechanical groan. Two bikers attacked simultaneously with tire irons, their coordination suggesting military training. The stranger ducked under their swings with fluid grace, swept both men's legs in one continuous motion, and watched them collapse into each other like dominoes. Another attacker came from behind with a chain, but the stranger seemed to have eyes. In the back of his head, a backward elbow strike to the solar plexus dropped the man instantly, his weapon clattering across the checkered floor. Each technique was textbook aikido and karate, using opponents' force against them, striking pressure points with surgical precision, maintaining perfect balance throughout the chaos. The remaining bikers hesitated, suddenly realizing they weren't facing an ordinary senior citizen, but someone with lethal skills honed over decades. In 90 seconds, 6 Hell's Wolves lay groaning on the floor among overturned chairs and broken glass. The stranger hadn't even broken a sweat, his breathing still controlled, and even as he straightened his black shirt, he looked calmly at the 5 remaining bikers, who backed toward the door with newfound respect and fear. The predators had become prey, and they knew it. Jenny, still kneeling beside the unconscious Earl, whispered to Dolores with awe and recognition dawning in her voice, "Oh my God, that's Steven Seagal." The name rippled through the room like electricity, and even the surviving Hell's Wolves stepped back with wide eyes. They knew that name, knew what it meant, knew they had made a terrible mistake. The remaining 5 Hell's Wolves dragged their unconscious and groaning comrades toward the shattered doorway, casting fearful glances back at Steven Seagal, who stood calmly among the wreckage of their attempted intimidation. The legend himself had just proven that some reputations were built on more than Hollywood magic. Crusher limped back through the destroyed window frame, bleeding from multiple cuts and nursing what was clearly a dislocated shoulder. His face was a mask of pain and humiliation as he realized he had been bested by a man old enough to be his father. The gang leader who had terrorized dozens of communities now couldn't meet the eyes of his own men. "This ain't over," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. Blood dripped from his split lip onto the gravel as he struggled to maintain his authority over men who had just watched him fly through a window like a rag doll. The Hell's Wolves retreated to their motorcycles, engines roaring as they sped out of Millerville with their tails between their legs, leaving behind only broken glass and the echo of their humiliation. Inside the diner, Seagal immediately shifted from warrior to healer. He knelt beside Earl, with the gentle hands of someone trained in emergency medicine, checking pulse and examining the head wound with professional competence. "Mild concussion," he diagnosed quietly, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "He needs medical attention, but he'll be fine." Using napkins and ice from the machine, he created a makeshift compress for Earl's injury while Jenny called the volunteer EMT service. Word spread quickly through the small town's interconnected community. Ruby herself emerged from the kitchen where she had hidden during the violence, her gray hair disheveled, but her eyes bright with admiration. She insisted on comping Seagal's meal and promised free coffee for life, her voice trembling with gratitude. Other townspeople began arriving, shopkeepers, ranchers, families, all wanting to see the mysterious stranger who had sent the bikers packing, but Seagal deflected praise. With characteristic humility, his soft-spoken manner unchanged by the violence, just did what anyone should do when innocent people are threatened. As the volunteer EMTs arrived to tend to Earl, who was regaining consciousness with groggy confusion, the sun began setting behind the Montana peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that promised peace after the storm. The rundown Bozeman Motel, 12 miles outside Millerville. Crusher McKenzie sat on his sagging bed, with his left arm fashioned into a makeshift sling from a torn t-shirt. His face was a map of cuts and bruises, but his pride was wounded deeper than his body could ever be. The remaining Hell's Wolves licked their wounds in adjacent rooms, their confidence shattered by a single man who had made them look like amateurs. In front of witnesses, word of this defeat would spread throughout the outlaw biker community like wildfire unless Crusher acted quickly to control the narrative. His humiliation burned hotter than his physical pain. He had built his reputation on being unstoppable, the kind of man who could walk into any room and own it through sheer intimidation. Now that reputation lay in ruins along with Ruby's front window. With his good hand, he dialed a number he had memorized but hoped never to use. His older brother Rex, the Reaper McKenzie, founder and president of the Iron Skulls Motorcycle Club, the most feared outlaw organization in the Pacific Northwest. Rex's voice came through the phone like gravel in a cement mixer. "This better be important, little brother." Crusher lied skillfully, his years of criminal experience serving him well. He painted himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack by some wannabe movie star martial artist who had sucker-punched him in front of innocent civilians. He claimed Seagal had threatened women and children, turning the defeat into a cowardly ambush rather than a fair fight. He disrespected the family name, Rex. Crusher continued, his voice gaining strength as he embellished the story. "Made us look weak in front of the whole town. If word gets out that some Hollywood pretty boy can push around the McKenzies." Rex's response was immediate and chilling. "I'll bring 40 of my best men. We'll be there tomorrow night. And this, Steven Seagal is going to learn what happens when you mess with the Iron Skulls." The phone went dead, and Crusher allowed himself a cruel smile despite his injuries. By tomorrow night, Millerville would burn, and Steven Seagal would pay dearly for his interference. Back in Millerville, Steven Seagal sat in peaceful meditation behind Ruby's diner, his back against the brick wall as stars emerged in the vast Montana sky. He breathed deeply, centering himself for whatever challenges lay ahead, unaware that 40 of the most dangerous criminals in the Northwest were already heading his way. Wednesday morning broke clear and bright over Millerville, the Montana sky stretching endlessly like a blue canvas painted with wispy clouds. Steven Seagal emerged from the small motel room where he had spent the night, having paid Martha Hendricks, the elderly proprietor, for a week in advance despite planning to leave soon. Word of yesterday's confrontation had spread throughout the town like ripples on a pond. As Seagal walked to Ruby's for breakfast, he was approached by grateful residents who wanted to shake his hand and share their appreciation for what he had done. Tom Bradford, Jenny's father and the town's mechanic, pumped Seagal's hand vigorously, while explaining how the Hell's Wolves had been intimidating his family for weeks during their previous visits to neighboring towns. His weathered face showed genuine relief as he spoke. "They've been working this whole region," Tom explained, his calloused hands gesturing toward the surrounding mountains, "hitting small places where the law can't respond fast enough. You probably saved a lot of folks from a lot of trouble." Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who ran the general store with the efficiency of someone who had been serving the community for 30 years, insisted on giving Seagal free supplies for his journey. But Seagal remained humble and uncomfortable with the attention, deflecting praise and insisting he only did what was necessary to tea the diner. Earl Patterson sat with his head bandaged, but his spirit intact, sharing coffee with Seagal and discussing the philosophy of justice with the wisdom of 4 decades wearing a badge. In 40 years of law enforcement, Earl reflected, stirring sugar into his cup, I learned that sometimes talking isn't enough. Sometimes evil men only understand one language. Seagal nodded thoughtfully, his dark eyes reflecting the morning light streaming through the repaired window. Violence should be the last resort, but when protecting innocence, sometimes it's the only option that works. Meanwhile, Ruby bustled about the diner, which showed signs of yesterday's battle. A boarded-up section where the window had been, scuffed floors, and replaced chairs. She refused Seagal's offer to pay for damages, insisting that heroes don't pay for defending their community. Jenny arrived for her shift, her wrists still showing faint bruises from Snake's grip, but her spirits lifted by the knowledge that the bullies were gone and justice had been served. As the peaceful morning passed, Pete Morrison pulled Seagal aside in the diner's gravel parking lot. The veteran trucker's weathered face was grave as he shared hard-earned wisdom from 3 decades hauling freight through the most dangerous territories in America. "Steven, I've driven through biker country for 30 years, Pete said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Gangs like the Hells Wolves don't forget when someone makes them look weak. More will come, and they'll be worse than the first bunch." Seagal listened intently, his dark eyes reflecting the seriousness of Pete's warning. Around them, Millerville continued its morning routine, but an undercurrent of tension ran beneath the surface normalcy like electricity through buried cables. Pete explained the hierarchy of outlaw motorcycle clubs with the expertise of someone who had navigated their territories for decades. "These clubs have networks across multiple states. They've got lawyers, corrupt cops, and enough firepower to wage war against small towns. What you did yesterday was heroic, but it may have painted a target on this whole community," Seagal acknowledged. The wisdom in Pete's words while explaining his own philosophy, developed through decades of martial arts training and real-world experience. A man can't live his life in fear of what might happen. Sometimes you have to take a stand, knowing the consequences. He spent the afternoon quietly helping around town, assisting Tom Bradford at his garage, carrying groceries for elderly residents who struggled with heavy bags, and sharing stories with children who were fascinated by meeting a real action. Movie starred A.T. the local library, run by retired teacher Patricia Donovan. He read to a group of elementary school children, his gentle demeanor contrasting sharply with his warrior reputation. The kids hung on every word as he told them stories about courage and standing up for what's right. As evening approached, Seagal found a quiet spot behind the diner where he could meditate undisturbed. He sat cross-legged on a worn blanket, his breathing deep and controlled, preparing mentally and spiritually for whatever challenges awaited him. His meditation reflected on the balance between peace and necessary violence, drawing on decades of martial arts training that emphasized spiritual discipline alongside physical technique. The warrior's path required both strength and wisdom, both action and restraint. As the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Seagal opened his eyes from meditation with a sense of calm readiness. For whatever the darkness might bring. .40 Iron Skull's motorcycles roared through the Montana darkness like mechanical locusts, their headlights cutting through the night as they approached Millerville at 11:30 p.m. on Wednesday. The convoy moved with military precision, maintaining formation and communication discipline that spoke of professional organization. Rex, the Reaper, McKenzie led the pack, a massive man in his early 40s with dead gray eyes and arms covered in prison tattoos depicting skulls, serpents, and violent imagery that told stories of a life lived without conscience. Unlike his younger brother's crude approach, Rex was a tactical thinker who had survived 2 decades in the outlaw world through intelligence and ruthless planning. His Iron Skulls were professional criminals who had graduated from petty intimidation to organized racketeering, drug trafficking, and murder for hire. They wore matching black leather vests with silver skull logos and carried military-grade weapons purchased from corrupt sources who asked no questions. The convoy stopped at the abandoned grain elevator on Millerville's outskirts, a massive, concrete structure that had been empty since the farm crisis of the 1980s destroyed the local agricultural economy. Rex established it as a command post, posting sentries and setting up communications equipment with the precision of a military operation. His lieutenant, Marcus Tombstone Torres, a former Army Ranger discharged for excessive violence during overseas deployments, coordinated patrol routes that would effectively seal the town from outside interference. His tactical expertise turned the grain elevator into a fortress overlooking Millerville like a concrete watchtower. Rex studied satellite photos of the town on a tablet computer, identifying key locations with the methodical approach of a general. Planning a siege, the sheriff's office, the school, the diner, and potential escape routes. His plan went far beyond simple revenge for his brother's humiliation. "We're not just here to deal with one troublemaker," he told his assembled crew, his voice carrying absolute authority. "We're establishing a foothold. This town is going to Become our new operations base for the entire region." The Iron Skulls nodded with understanding. They weren't simple thugs seeking quick gratification. They were building an empire. One intimidated community at a time. As the Iron Skulls completed their tactical preparation, Rex stood atop the grain elevator, surveying Millerville's sleeping streets through night vision binoculars. In the distance, a single light burned in Ruby's diner, where Steven Seagal sat quietly, seemingly unaware of the army arrayed against him in the darkness. Thursday morning at 6 a.m., the Iron Skulls began their systematic terrorization of Millerville, with the precision of a military psychological warfare campaign. Unlike the Hell's Wolves' crude approach, this was calculated intimidation designed to break the community's spirit before the final confrontation. Rex deployed his men in coordinated teams throughout the town, each group assigned specific targets and objectives. At Henderson's hardware store, four bikers browsed merchandise while making veiled threats about protection services and insurance against accidents. Owner Bob Henderson, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, stood his ground initially, his military training kicking in as he assessed the tactical situation. But he realized he was outgunned when one biker casually mentioned knowing where his grandchildren attended school in the next county, at the post office. Bikers intercepted mail delivery and rifled through residents' correspondence, making notes of family members living out of state who might be visited if cooperation wasn't forthcoming. The violation of federal mail was just another crime on their growing list. The grain elevator's height provided perfect surveillance of the entire town, with spotters reporting civilian movements via radio in military terminology that spoke of professional training. Rex coordinated the operation like a general directing a siege, moving pieces on his strategic chessboard. Families began keeping children indoors as black-clad bikers cruised residential streets, revving engines outside homes and taking photographs of license plates for future reference. The psychological pressure was expertly applied. No overt violence yet, just the promise of it hanging over everything like a storm cloud ready to burst. Deputy Maria Rodriguez finally returned from her distant domestic call, but she was a single officer facing 40 professional criminals with military equipment and tactical training. She radioed for state police backup, but the nearest available units were dealing with a multi-car accident on Interstate 90 and wouldn't arrive until evening at earliest. The Iron Skulls had chosen their timing with surgical precision, studying law enforcement response patterns and striking during the perfect window of vulnerability at Ruby's diner. Seagal observed the unfolding situation with growing concern, his tactical mind recognizing the professional nature of the operation. These weren't the same amateur thugs from yesterday. This was a military-style occupation by experienced criminals who understood the art of warfare. As the intimidation campaign escalated throughout the morning, Tom Bradford's garage became a focal point when 6 bikers surrounded the building, trapping the mechanic inside. Bradford's garage. Tom Bradford worked beneath a raised pickup truck when the rumble of motorcycles announced the Iron Skulls' arrival. 6 bikers, led by Tombstone Torres, surrounded the building as Tom emerged with a wrench in his oil-stained hands, his military instincts immediately assessing the tactical situation. Tom's experience in Desert Storm kicked in as he recognized fellow veterans among his attackers. Tombstone, with his ranger tattoos and professional bearing, offered grudging respect as he approached. "Army? Marines?" Tombstone asked, noting Tom's defensive stance and tactical awareness. "Army Corps of Engineers," Tom replied steadily, his grip tightening on the wrench as he calculated distances and escape routes. "Then you know how this works," Tombstone said with cold professionalism. "We're taking over this town's protection services. Your cooperation ensures your family's safety. Your resistance ensures the opposite." But Tom had spent 19 years building his business and raising his daughter in this community after his wife's death from cancer. The garage represented everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made to provide Jenny with a future. When he refused to pay protection money or provide free services to the Iron Skulls, Tombstone's expression hardened with military efficiency. "Wrong answer, soldier." The beating was methodical and professional, designed to inflict maximum pain without causing fatal injury. Tom fought back with tools as weapons, his military training serving him well as he managed to wound two bikers with a tire iron and socket wrench before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. They left him bloodied but conscious, his garage trashed, and a message spray-painted on the wall in red letters: "Comply or die." His ribs were cracked, his right hand possibly broken, but his spirit remained unbroken. News of the attack spread quickly through Millerville's tight-knit community via phone calls and CB radio. At the diner, Jenny broke down when she saw her father's condition as the volunteer EMTs loaded him into the ambulance for transport to the county hospital. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic conquest designed to break the community's will to resist. The message was clear: submit or suffer the consequences. Seagal arrived at the garage to find blood on the concrete floor and defiance in Tom's swollen eyes. "They think they can take our town," Tom gasped through split lips. "But we've got something they don't understand. We've got you." Seagal walked through Millerville's streets in broad daylight Thursday afternoon, his presence providing a psychological counterbalance to the Iron Skull's intimidation campaign. Despite the morning's violence, his calm authority seemed to draw courage from the very air around him. Townspeople emerged from hiding to gather around their unexpected protector, seeking reassurance and leadership in a crisis that had escalated beyond their worst fears. At Ruby's Diner, which had become an unofficial command center, residents shared information and coordinated mutual protection efforts. Earl Patterson, despite his bandaged head and doctor's orders to rest, organized neighborhood watch groups using his 4 decades of law enforcement experience. His tactical knowledge proved invaluable as he assigned patrol routes and communication protocols. Ruby insisted on keeping the diner open as a symbol of resistance, serving free coffee to anyone willing to stand guard and refusing to let criminals dictate when her business operated. Her defiance inspired others to find their own courage. Seagal addressed the gathered townspeople with quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. These men feed on fear. When communities stand together, bullies lose their power, no matter how many weapons they carry. He shared tactical advice from his military consultancy work: how to secure homes, establish communication networks, and recognize surveillance patterns. The mood lifted as people realized they weren't helpless victims, but citizens with rights worth defending. Jenny coordinated a phone tree to keep isolated families informed, while Pete Morrison used his CB radio to contact other truckers who might provide support or witness testimony. Even Mrs. Vasquez, despite her advanced age, volunteered to monitor Iron Skull's movements from her store's strategic location. The afternoon passed with growing optimism as the community discovered its collective strength. Seagal shared lighter moments too, stories from his Hollywood career that made people laugh, demonstrations of basic self-defense moves, and philosophical discussions about courage and justice. For a few precious hours, it seemed like the town might weather this storm through unity and determination. The Iron Skulls had underestimated the power of a community united behind a common cause. But as evening approached and the community prepared for a night of organized resistance, Deputy Rodriguez received a frantic radio call that shattered their hope. Multiple hostages taken at various locations. Armed suspects demand immediate surrender of Steven Seagal, or they start executing civilians in 15 minutes. Deputy Rodriguez's radio crackled with the terrifying report as panic spread through the diner like wildfire. Rex McKenzie's voice came through on all emergency frequencies, calm and professional as death itself. "This is a simple business transaction," his gravelly voice announced. "Deliver Steven Seagal to the grain elevator within 1 hour, or we begin executing hostages every 15 minutes. No negotiation. No extensions." Rex's tactical brilliance became apparent as reports flooded in from across Millerville. While Seagal and the townspeople had organized their resistance at the diner, Iron Skull strike teams had simultaneously hit multiple targets with military precision during the afternoon's apparent calm. At the elementary school, 3 bikers had overpowered elderly custodian Frank Martinez during his evening cleaning rounds, taking him hostage along with 2 teachers who had stayed late grading papers. The retirement home on Elm Street had been infiltrated during evening medication rounds. For elderly residents, including Earl's beloved wife Martha, were now captives. Most devastating of all, Jenny's younger brother Billy, age 16, had been grabbed while walking home from his part-time job at the hardware store, his backpack scattered across the sidewalk where he had struggled against his captors. The hostages were being held at separate locations throughout town, making rescue attempts nearly impossible without civilian casualties. Rex demonstrated his seriousness by allowing brief phone calls from the terrified captives, their frightened voices confirming they were alive but in immediate danger. The psychological warfare was perfect in its cruelty. Seagal must choose between his own safety and the lives of innocents, while the community faced the horror of watching their loved ones suffer for their defiance against criminal occupation. Deputy Rodriguez was powerless. Any assault on the hostage locations would result in civilian deaths, and state police were still hours away. Her single patrol car and service weapon were useless against 40 professional criminals with military equipment. The townspeople looked desperately to Seagal, but what could one man do against such overwhelming odds? The situation appeared hopeless as Rex's deadline approached with mechanical inevitability, each passing minute bringing them closer to unthinkable tragedy. With 30 minutes remaining in Rex's ultimatum, Seagal made the only choice his conscience allowed. He walked out of Ruby's diner into the gathering darkness, heading toward the grain elevator and what appeared to be certain death. Steven Seagal walked alone down Millerville's main street toward the grain elevator, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the town like a burial shroud. Iron Skull's members emerged from shadows and doorways, forming a corridor of leather and steel that funneled him toward his destination, the grain elevator. Rex McKenzie had orchestrated a scene designed for maximum psychological impact and symbolic dominance. The hostages, Frank Martinez, the 2 teachers, Martha Patterson, the 4 retirement home residents, and 16-year-old Billy Bradford, were bound and seated in the center of the elevator's main floor. 30 armed Iron Skulls surrounded them in concentric circles, their weapons trained on the innocent civilians while floodlights illuminated the concrete space like a theater stage. Rex positioned himself on an elevated platform overlooking the scene, savoring his moment of absolute control. When Seagal arrived, he was immediately surrounded and searched for weapons with professional thoroughness, then forced to his knees beside the terrified hostages. Young Billy tried to look brave, but tears streamed down his face as he thought of his sister and injured father. Rex delivered a speech that revealed his true intentions with chilling clarity. This wasn't just about revenge for his brothers' humiliation, but about establishing Iron Skull's territory and sending a message throughout the criminal underworld. "Your movie career taught people that one man can make a difference," Rex announced with cold satisfaction, his voice echoing off concrete walls. "Tonight, we're going to teach a different lesson. We're going to show the world what happens to heroes in the real world." The plan was diabolical in its thoroughness. Rex intended to execute Seagal and all the hostages, then burn Millerville as an example to other communities that might resist Iron Skull's operations. Video equipment recorded everything for distribution through criminal networks, ensuring maximum psychological impact. As Rex revealed the full scope of his murderous intentions, Seagal realized that surrender hadn't saved anyone. It had only ensured that innocent people would die alongside him. The hostages would be executed regardless, their deaths serving as a lesson in the futility of resistance. The situation appeared utterly hopeless as 30 weapons pointed at the bound group, and Rex savored his moment of triumph with the patience of a predator who had cornered his prey at last. Rex McKenzie raised his pistol toward Seagal's head, finger tightening on the trigger as the hostages closed their eyes and prepared for the inevitable. With Rex's gun inches from his skull and 30 other weapons trained on him, Steven Seagal closed his eyes and entered a state of perfect mental clarity, drawing on 50 years of martial arts training and spiritual discipline that had prepared him for exactly this moment. In the seconds before apparent death, Seagal's mind flashed through pivotal moments that had forged his character. Training in Japan as a young man under masters who taught that true strength comes from spiritual discipline rather than physical force. His sensei's teachings about Bushido and the warrior's duty to protect innocence regardless of personal cost. He remembered early Hollywood days when he insisted on doing his own stunts because authentic action required genuine skill, and decades of real-world experience where he learned that reputation means nothing without the character to back it up. when lives hang in the balance. His breathing became completely controlled, his heart rate dropped to almost meditative levels, and his awareness expanded to encompass every detail of his environment, the positions of all 31 enemies, the location of potential weapons, the tactical layout of the grain elevator's industrial architecture. Most importantly, he calculated the exact positions of the innocent hostages who must be protected at all costs, their safety taking priority over everything else, including his own survival. Rex's monologue provided precious seconds for this mental preparation, his ego demanding an audience for his triumph over Hollywood's most famous action star. But Seagal was no longer listening to threats. He was calculating angles, distances, and probabilities with the precision of a military strategist. His bound hands worked slowly at his restraints, using techniques learned from Houdini consultation. Work for movie stunts, while his body remained perfectly still to avoid detection. The ropes were tight, but not impossible for someone who understood leverage and anatomy. The spiritual dimension of his training kicked in, the Zen concept of Mushin, or no mind, where action flows from instinct rather than conscious thought. He became one with the moment, ready to act when opportunity presented itself. Rex's finger began to squeeze the trigger, but in that microsecond, Seagal's eyes snapped open with deadly focus and absolute clarity. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm of absolute certainty. "I do have last words. Never underestimate the will of a righteous man." Seagal's restraints fell away as he exploded into motion, his movements so sudden and unexpected that Rex's shot went wide, the bullet sparking off concrete where Seagal's head had been a split second earlier. Using an advanced aikido technique, Seagal rolled backward and sprang to his feet in one fluid motion, grabbing Rex's gun hand and using the biker's own momentum to flip him off the elevated platform. Rex crashed into 3 of his men below, creating instant chaos as the carefully orchestrated execution became a desperate melee. Seagal's first priority was freeing the hostages. He cut their bonds with a knife taken from the nearest iron skull, using joint locks and pressure points to disable guards without killing them in front of civilian witnesses who would carry these memories forever. "When I say run, head for the back exit and don't stop until you reach the diner," he commanded, with absolute authority. Young Billy Bradford hesitated, wanting to help his rescuer, but Seagal's tone brooked no argument. "Protect the others. That's how you help me." The grain elevator's concrete structure worked both for and against Seagal. It provided cover from gunfire, but also trapped him with limited escape routes. However, his knowledge of urban combat environments, gained from military consultation work, gave him crucial tactical advantages that he used: the elevation changes, shadows cast by industrial equipment, and the building's architectural features to divide and conquer his enemies. The confined space that should have been his tomb became his ally as he controlled the flow of battle. The fighting was more intense than anything he had faced before. These were trained killers with military backgrounds, not street thugs, and they adapted quickly to his unconventional tactics. But Seagal's decades of experience showed as he turned their own aggression against them. Using aikido principles, he redirected their force while striking with surgical karate precision at nerve centers and joint vulnerabilities. Every movement had purpose. Every technique served multiple functions. Disable the immediate threat while positioning for the next encounter. The hostages made their escape during the chaos, Martha Patterson helping young Billy while Frank Martinez assisted. The teachers. Their freedom gave Seagal the psychological edge he desperately needed. No longer fighting defensively to protect others, he could go on the offensive. As the last hostage disappeared into the Montana darkness, Seagal stood alone in the grain elevator, surrounded by 25 Iron Skull's members who now realized they were facing something far more dangerous than an aging action star. The grain elevator became a concrete cathedral of combat as 25 Iron Skulls converged on Seagal from all directions, their weapons glinting in the harsh floodlights while their boots echoed off the industrial walls like thunder in an enclosed storm. What followed was the ultimate demonstration of martial arts mastery, Seagal flowing through his attackers like water through stone, each encounter showcasing different aspects of his lifelong dedication to the warrior's path. Against knife-wielding opponents, he employed classical aikido disarms, catching wrists and applying leverage that forced weapons to clatter across concrete floors. When facing multiple attackers with clubs and chains, he moved in tight circles, never allowing them to coordinate their assault while picking them off individually with surgical precision. Each technique flowed seamlessly into the next like movements in a deadly dance choreographed by decades of training. Point 3 Bikers attempted a coordinated assault from different levels of the grain elevator's industrial structure, but Seagal's spatial awareness allowed him to flow between their attacks, using one man as a shield against the others before dropping all three with precise nerve strikes to pressure points. The concrete environment became his ally as he used walls and pillars to limit attack angles, while industrial equipment provided improvised weapons when needed. A conveyor belt became a launching pad, steel railings became leverage points for throws, and shadows became concealment. His breathing remained controlled throughout the battle, each technique delivered with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. The philosophy of aikido, using opponents' force against them, proved devastatingly effective against men who relied on aggression and strength rather than technique and wisdom. The remaining Iron Skulls began to show fear as their numbers dwindled systematically. This wasn't the confused melee they had expected, but a systematic dismantling of their force by a true master who had spent 70 years perfecting his craft. Seagal's movements demonstrated the difference between learning to fight and mastering the warrior's way. Every block flowed into a counterattack. Every throw positioned him for the next encounter. Every strike served both offensive and defensive purposes simultaneously. 15 Iron Skulls lay unconscious or incapacitated on the concrete floor as the remaining 10, including Rex and Tombstone, backed toward the elevator's main exit with newfound respect for their opponent. But their retreat was cut off by an unexpected sound: pickup trucks and motorcycles roaring into the grain elevator's parking area, accompanied by voices shouting encouragement and determination. Led by Earl Patterson despite his head injury and doctor's orders, a convoy of Millerville residents stormed the grain elevator's perimeter like cavalry arriving at the last possible moment. Tom Bradford drove his tow truck despite his taped ribs, while Pete Morrison followed in his 18-wheeler, and a dozen other townspeople arrived on motorcycles, ATVs, and in pickup trucks. The community's arrival transformed the tactical situation completely, turning a desperate last stand into a coordinated assault on criminal occupation. Earl coordinated the civilian force with military precision, having spent his drive to the elevator organizing a battle plan via CB radio with the tactical expertise of 40 years in law enforcement. The townspeople were armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and the kind of weapons found in any rural American community, plus the righteous anger of people defending their homes, families, and way of life against criminal invasion. Their courage was born not of training but of necessity, not of aggression but of love for what they were protecting. Tom Bradford's mechanical expertise proved invaluable as he used his tow truck to block the Iron Skull's escape route, while Pete Morrison positioned his massive 18-wheeler to provide cover for advancing townspeople. The coordination was impressive for civilians who had never fought together before. Ruby herself arrived in her ancient Ford pickup, carrying a double-barreled shotgun that had belonged to her late husband and determination that would have shamed men half her age. "Nobody messes with my town," she declared with quiet fury. The Iron Skulls found themselves caught between Seagal inside the elevator and an angry community outside. Exactly the kind of coordinated resistance they had never expected from small-town sheep, who were supposed to submit to superior firepower and organization. Jenny Bradford, despite orders to stay behind at the hospital with her father, arrived with Deputy Rodriguez and the emergency medical team to treat wounded civilians. Her presence reminded everyone what they were fighting for: the next generation's right to grow up free from fear and intimidation. The battle became a true community effort, with each resident contributing their unique skills. Frank Martinez used his custodial knowledge of the building's layout to guide flanking maneuvers, while Mrs. Vasquez coordinated communications from her general store's radio setup. The symbolic power was overwhelming. This wasn't just about defeating criminals, but about a community rediscovering its collective strength and willingness to fight for shared values against overwhelming odds. As the coordinated assault intensified, From outside, while Seagal continued his systematic dismantling of resistance inside, Crusher McKenzie emerged from behind industrial equipment where he had been hiding, seeking one final chance at redemption. Crusher McKenzie, driven by humiliation and desperate rage, crept through shadows towards Seagal's position with his arm still in a makeshift sling, a switchblade gleaming in his good hand as he prepared for a coward's attack from behind. Despite the chaos of battle raging around him, gunfire echoing off concrete walls, townspeople shouting encouragement from outside, and Iron Skull's members groaning on the floor, Seagal's heightened awareness detected the threat without turning around. As Crusher lunged with his blade aimed at Seagal's spine, the martial arts master spun at the last second, catching the biker's wrist with both hands in a classical aikido wrist control technique that had been perfected over decades of training. The knife flew harmlessly across the concrete as Crusher screamed in pain, his injured shoulder protesting the sudden stress of the defensive maneuver. His face contorted with agony as pressure points sent fire through his nervous system. "You should have stayed down," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger, the tone of a teacher addressing a student who had failed to learn an important lesson. The confrontation became a demonstration of the difference between brute force and disciplined technique. Crusher, despite his size and steroid-enhanced strength, flailed helplessly as Seagal controlled him with minimal effort, using precise pressure points and joint manipulations to keep the bigger man off balance. "Violence without honor is the way of cowards," Seagal explained as he systematically dismantled Crusher's attempts to fight back, each defensive move flowing into educational commentary. "You target the innocent, terrorize families, and attack from behind. That's not strength, it's weakness wearing a mask." Crusher threw wild punches with his good arm, but Seagal deflected each one while applying increasing pressure to nerve centers that sent waves of paralysis through the biker's body. The lesson was as much philosophical as physical. The fight ended with a precise nerve strike to the carotid artery that dropped Crusher unconscious, his body going limp as specific pressure points cut off blood flow to his brain temporarily. It was a merciful ending for a man who had shown no mercy to others. Outside, the sounds of battle continued as townspeople and remaining Iron Skulls engaged in fierce combat. But the tide had clearly turned in favor of the defenders who fought for love rather than profit. As Crusher collapsed into unconsciousness, Rex, the Reaper, McKenzie appeared at the top of a concrete stairway, his massive frame silhouetted against emergency lighting, preparing for the final confrontation. Rex McKenzie descended the concrete stairs with predatory grace, his military-grade assault weapon trained on Seagal, while his dead gray eyes reflected years of violence and cruelty that had shaped him into something barely human. "Just you and me now, movie star," he growled, his voice echoing off the industrial walls like the promise of death itself. The final battle was a clash of philosophies as much as physical combat. Rex representing everything wrong with unchecked aggression, violence for profit, intimidation of innocence, and strength used to exploit rather than protect the vulnerable. Seagal embodied the warrior's code, discipline earned through decades of training, honor maintained despite overwhelming odds, and power wielded responsibly in service of justice rather than personal gain. That Rex's military training made him a formidable opponent with tactical knowledge and weapons expertise, but his techniques were corrupted by years of criminal excess and steroid abuse that had enhanced his strength while diminishing his wisdom. He was younger and stronger than Seagal, with longer reach and modern weapons training, but he lacked the spiritual discipline that transforms mere fighting into martial art. His movements were powerful but predictable, driven by rage rather than strategy. The confrontation moved through different phases as they battled across the grain elevator's multiple levels. First, Rex tried to use his rifle's range advantage, but Seagal's knowledge of cover and movement, gained from military consultation work, allowed him to close distance while avoiding gunfire. When forced into close combat, Rex revealed hand-to-hand skills learned during his army service, but they were crude compared to Seagal's refined technique developed over 50 years of dedicated study under the world's greatest masters. The battle showcased the difference between learning to fight and mastering the warrior's way. Rex's attacks were powerful but telegraphed, his combinations predictable to someone who had spent decades studying the geometry of violence. Seagal's responses flowed like water around stone, redirecting force, using Rex's aggression against him, and striking with surgical precision at nerve points and joint vulnerabilities that caused maximum disruption with minimum effort. The concrete environment provided both challenges and opportunities as they fought across conveyor systems, around massive support pillars, and up steel staircases that rang with the impact of their combat. The climax came when Rex, frustrated by his inability to land decisive blows against an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move, made a desperate lunge with a tactical knife, exposing himself completely in his rage-fueled attack. Rex McKenzie's desperate knife attack left him completely exposed as Seagal stepped aside with fluid grace, caught Rex's extended arm in an aikido control hold, and used a combination throw to send the criminal leader crashing through a wooden safety barrier into industrial machinery below. Rex lay unconscious among twisted metal conveyor equipment as flashing red and blue lights began filling the grain elevator's windows. State police and FBI units had finally arrived in response to Deputy Rodriguez's emergency calls that had been broadcasting. For hours, the aftermath revealed the scope of the Iron Skull's complete defeat. Of the original 40 members, 35 were unconscious or incapacitated by Seagal's systematic dismantling of their organization, while the remaining 5 had surrendered to townspeople after seeing their leaders fall. Not a single civilian casualty had occurred during the final battle, thanks to the coordinated effort between Seagal's tactical expertise and the community's determination to protect their own. The hostages were all safe, the criminals defeated, and justice served. Federal agents, led by seasoned FBI agent Patricia Hartwell, arrived to find the largest outlaw motorcycle club bust in regional history spread across the grain elevators. Concrete floors. The Iron Skulls faced federal charges including racketeering, kidnapping, assault with deadly weapons, and conspiracy to commit murder. Evidence seized from their temporary headquarters revealed connections to drug trafficking, arms dealing, and murder for hire across multiple states. The investigation would ultimately dismantle criminal networks that had operated with impunity for decades. Agent Hartwell interviewed Seagal with professional respect, recognizing his military consultation credentials and understanding that his actions were completely justified under civilian defense statutes. The statement process was brief. Too many witnesses had seen the Iron Skulls initiate violence and take hostages. Medical teams treated the defeated criminals with professional care, though many would require extended hospitalization for their injuries before facing trial and inevitable conviction. The evidence against them was overwhelming and undeniable. The townspeople received recognition for their courage, particularly Earl Patterson's tactical leadership and Tom Bradford's mechanical expertise in blocking escape routes. Their bravery had turned the tide when professional law enforcement was unavailable. Media attention began building as word spread of the small town that stood up to organized crime and won. But Seagal deflected interview requests with characteristic humility, insisting the real heroes were the residents who had fought for their community. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Steven Seagal sat quietly on Ruby's diner steps, drinking coffee and watching FBI agents load the last of the Iron Skulls into transport vehicles while Millerville began returning to normal life, forever changed by their victory. 1 week later, Millerville organized a modest ceremony in the town square to honor those who had defended the community against criminal occupation. A small crowd gathered around the gazebo where Mayor Dorothy Chun presented certificates of appreciation to the civilian defenders. The ceremony reflected the community's values of humility and service over self-promotion, focusing on collective courage rather than individual heroics. Earl Patterson received recognition for tactical leadership, Tom Bradford for mechanical support despite his injuries, Pete Morrison for logistical coordination, and Ruby for maintaining community morale. When fear threatened to overwhelm hope, Steven Seagal was offered the key to the city. But he politely deflected the honor with characteristic humility, insisting that heroism carried its own reward and that recognition belonged to those who had chosen to stand together when tested. His brief speech focused on the importance of communities supporting each other and individuals standing up for what's right regardless of personal cost or potential consequences. True strength isn't about what you can do to others, he told the assembled crowd. his soft voice carrying absolute conviction. But what you're willing to do for others when they cannot protect themselves. The week had brought positive changes to Millerville that would last for generations. Tourism inquiries had increased as word spread of the town's courage. Several new businesses had expressed interest in relocating to a community with such strong character, and residents had developed a deeper appreciation for their neighbors. Jenny Bradford had received scholarship offers from several universities, impressed by her composure during the crisis and her role in coordinating community communications. Tom's garage had seen increased business from truckers who respected his stand against criminal intimidation. As the ceremony concluded, Seagal prepared to depart on his Harley-Davidson, his original journey continuing wherever the road led him. Next, the motorcycle waited patiently, chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun, ready to carry its rider toward whatever destiny awaited. Jenny presented him with a photograph of everyone at Ruby's diner, taken during the peaceful moment before the Iron Skulls had arrived, a reminder of the good he had helped preserve and the community bonds that would endure long after his departure. "Come back anytime, Mr. Seagal," she said with genuine warmth and gratitude that spoke for the entire town. Steven Seagal started his motorcycle and rode toward the horizon, disappearing into the vast Montana landscape as Millerville continued its daily life, stronger, more united, and secure in the knowledge that sometimes heroes appear exactly when they're needed most. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.